Imagine for a moment a world where the Cold War never happened, where the ideological tensions between the Eastern and Western blocs never existed. A world where NATO and the Soviet bloc were on the same side, working together instead of clashing fiercely. Sounds impossible, right? After all, the Cold War was one of the most intense periods in modern history, marked by distrust, espionage, and a struggle for global dominance. But what if I told you that, at one critical moment in history, the Soviet Union actually tried to join NATO? Yes, the same Soviet Union that was at the center of the Cold War attempted to become part of a military alliance created specifically to counter its power. This happened just before what many consider the peak of the East-West divide, just before the Iron Curtain was firmly in place. Now, imagine the impact that would have had. What if the Soviets had been accepted? Would the world have become a more peaceful place? Or would this shift have only accelerated a new series of conflicts? In this video, we'll explore a forgotten chapter of history that could have completely changed the trajectory of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's offer to join NATO is one of the most intriguing and controversial moments of the 20th century, and what happened next can teach us a lot about how geopolitical decisions can shape the world's future. Stick around, because this story might make you rethink everything you know about the events that defined the last century. When we think about the Cold War, it's easy to imagine it as a fierce and unyielding ideological struggle. On one side, you have the Western powers, led by NATO, representing capitalist democracy, and on the other, the Eastern Bloc, spearheaded by the Soviet Union, promoting communism. The tensions were palpable, and the world seemed locked in a state of permanent rivalry, with both sides constantly maneuvering for influence, military superiority, and ideological dominance. However, history has an unexpected twist that challenges this view. Did you know that, at one point, the Soviet Union actually made a formal request to join NATO? Yes, the very same NATO alliance that was established to protect the West from Soviet influence, to contain the spread of communism across Europe. This revelation seems almost unbelievable when you consider the years of propaganda, espionage, and military standoffs between the two blocs. The question naturally arises: why on earth would the USSR, the very nation NATO was built to oppose, want to join this alliance? Was it a desperate plea from a regime looking to avoid further isolation, or could it have been a highly strategic political move? In this video, we'll dive deep into this fascinating and lesser-known chapter of history. We'll explore the motivations behind the Soviet request, the geopolitical landscape of the time, and what this moment meant for global politics. By examining this pivotal event, we'll shed light on the complexities of the Cold War and uncover how a single decision could have radically altered the course of history. Stick with us as we unravel a story that has been largely forgotten, but holds great significance in understanding the dynamics of international relations during this critical period. To fully understand why the USSR would even consider joining NATO, we have to take a step back and look at the historical context. After World War II, Europe was in ruins. The major powers were trying to rebuild, but the ideological lines were already being drawn. On one side, you had the capitalist West, led by the United States, and on the other side, the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. These two sides were locked in a struggle for influence, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. In 1949, NATO was formed as a response to the growing fear of Soviet expansion. The West was terrified that the USSR, with its massive military might and communist ideology, would spread its influence across Europe, taking over countries one by one. NATO's purpose was clear. It was a defensive alliance designed to protect its members from the Soviet threat. Now, here's where things get interesting. Fast forward to the early 1950s. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin's successors, begins to reassess its foreign policy. After Stalin's death in 1953, the USSR was looking for ways to stabilize its position on the global stage. And one of the boldest ideas was to seek membership in NATO. The reasoning behind this move wasn't as crazy as it might seem. The USSR had a massive military presence in Eastern Europe, and it wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of NATO as a purely anti-Soviet alliance. So, in 1954, the Soviet Union made an official request to join NATO. But why would they want to join an alliance that had been created to counter them? The answer lies in the geopolitical dynamics at the time. If NATO accepted the USSR's offer, it would fundamentally change the nature of the alliance. NATO would no longer be an anti-Soviet bloc, it would become a more general European defensive alliance. Furthermore, it would allow the USSR to maintain control over its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, while also keeping Germany disarmed, something the Soviets were deeply concerned about after the devastation of World War II. Of course, NATO rejected the Soviet request. The Western powers, particularly the United States, were unwilling to accept the USSR into a defensive alliance, seeing it as a threat to the balance of power in Europe. Officially, the rejection was based on the USSR's non-democratic government and its occupation of Eastern Europe. But in reality, it was clear that the West was not willing to allow the Soviet Union to become a part of their defensive circle. The rejection of the USSR's offer had significant consequences. The Soviets, feeling snubbed and threatened, responded by forming their own military alliance in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. This pact brought together the USSR and several of its satellite states in Eastern Europe, solidifying the division of Europe into two opposing blocs, NATO in the West and the Warsaw Pact in the East. The formation of the Warsaw Pact marked a significant turning point in the Cold War. It formalized the division of Europe and set the stage for decades of geopolitical tension. NATO, as the Western defensive alliance, now had a clear counter in the form of the Warsaw Pact. The two sides would face off in a struggle for ideological and military supremacy that lasted for nearly half a century. But the rejection of the USSR's NATO membership wasn't just about military alliances. It was also about the broader ideological battle between communism and capitalism, between authoritarianism and democracy. The Cold War wasn't just about military power. It was a war of ideas, and the refusal to allow the USSR into NATO reinforced the West's commitment to its democratic values. So, what can we learn from this fascinating historical moment? The story of the USSR's attempt to join NATO reminds us of how fragile international relations can be. In a moment of tension and rivalry, even the most unlikely alliances and offers can emerge. It also highlights how geopolitical decisions are shaped by both strategic interests and ideological commitments. In today's world, we still see echoes of this Cold War mentality. International alliances continue to be formed based on ideological alignment, and the tension between East and West is still palpable in global politics. However, the example of the USSR's offer to join NATO serves as a reminder that diplomacy, at its core, is about understanding and finding common ground, even when it seems impossible. Would things have been different if NATO had accepted the USSR's offer? It's impossible to say for certain, but one can imagine a world where the Cold War was less about military confrontation and more about peaceful coexistence. Perhaps a unified Europe, with both Western and Eastern powers cooperating within a single defensive framework, could have prevented decades of conflict. Today, there are still lessons to be learned from this moment in history. Diplomacy, dialogue, and openness to compromise are essential in preventing future conflicts. The world is interconnected, and it's only through cooperation that we can address the challenges of the 21st century. The Soviet Union's attempt to join NATO stands out as one of the most intriguing and unexpected moments in Cold War history. At first glance, it might seem like an odd request. The USSR, the very power that NATO was formed to counter, asking to become part of that same alliance. However, this seemingly improbable moment reveals just how much the trajectory of global events can be altered by a single decision, a single turning point. This was a rare opportunity for a fundamental shift in the dynamics between East and West, one that could have reshaped the Cold War and the entire structure of global diplomacy. When NATO rejected the Soviet Union's request, it set in motion a chain of events that led directly to the creation of the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance designed to solidify Soviet control over Eastern Europe and create a clear opposition to the West. This division between the Eastern Bloc and NATO deepened the ideological and political rift that defined much of the 20th century. The Cold War intensified, and Europe became even more polarized, with the Iron Curtain firmly in place. The rejection also solidified the notion that the two superpowers could never reconcile their visions for the world. However, the ripple effects of this episode were not entirely negative. The rejection, while reinforcing the division, also opened the door for new opportunities in global diplomacy. Over time, both the West and the East would come to recognize the importance of dialogue and negotiation, particularly during moments of intense crisis, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or the eventual arms reduction talks in the 1980s. The moment of rejection pushed both sides to refine their strategies and recognize that cooperation, even if just in some areas, was necessary to avoid catastrophic outcomes. This episode serves as a powerful reminder of how history is often full of unexpected twists and turns. What might seem like an irreversible decision, a rejection, or a failed offer can be the catalyst for new paths forward. The choices made by world leaders during key moments, especially in times of heightened tension, have consequences that can echo for generations. Ultimately, this story underscores that diplomacy and global relations are never set in stone. They are fluid, shaped by human choices, and always subject to the whims of the time. As we reflect on this chapter in history, we're reminded that even the smallest decisions can profoundly alter the course of human events. If you found this deep dive into Cold War history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of world history, geopolitics, and pivotal moments that shaped our world. We love diving into the stories that often go untold, and your support helps us continue bringing these narratives to light. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think would have happened if NATO had actually accepted the Soviet Union's request? Would the world have avoided the deep divisions of the Cold War, or would it have led to new, unforeseen challenges? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We're always excited to hear different perspectives from our community. If you're passionate about understanding the turning points of history and the decisions that changed the course of global events, make sure to check out our other videos. We dive into a range of topics that challenge conventional wisdom and encourage thought-provoking discussions. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and keep exploring the world of history and geopolitics with us. Remember, the past is full of lessons waiting to be uncovered, and who knows, the next turning point could be just a click away. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.